questions. All right, let's get started. Dr. Michael Mohammed Ahmad. In 2012, he founded the Sweatshop literacy movement in Western Sydney, of which Winnie is now the general manager, I believe. In 2014, he published a book called The Tribe, which won the Sydney Morning Herald's Best Young Novelist of the Year award. 2018, his book The Lebs was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award and won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award. And in 2021, he published The Other Half of You. Shankari Chandran is an Australian novelist who won the 2023 Miles Franklin Award. So we have a Miles Franklin nominee, a Miles Franklin winner, and a prospective Miles Franklin winner here on the stage. Can I just say, for a Crime Writers Festival, we've never had so many literary winners on the stage together in one place.
Also, Sue, twice nominated, I believe. Is that right?
Twice? No. Oh my
Well,
goodness.
anything that's worth mentioning, because my daughter, when I asked her if she would come to the Miles Franklin Award this year, she said, you know, so sorry, Mommy, she's interstate studying. She said, oh, sorry, I can't do it. Got exams, but don't worry, I'll come next year. So I was like, yeah, I think only Mohammed.
I love that, like it's a thing. Winnie, you are writing a book at the moment. You are the editor of Another Australia, and your debut novel, Dirt Poor Islanders, is coming out 2024. Is it done?
I'm working on the typeset as we speak, and I'm really stressed about it. So, yeah. Well, let's not go there. But yeah.
Is your mic on?
March 27. Yes, it is.
Oh, good.
March 27.
March
Dirt
27.
Poor Islanders. Thank
Okay.
you, Hachette.
It's going to win a Miles Franklin. Don't worry. Okay. What I thought we'd do to start with is I actually would like each of the authors to just give us the setup for their most recent book. And because you're the most recent, and it's the most recent in your head, Winnie, tell us about your book.
Yeah, so Dirt Poor Islanders, it will be the first novel, so a work of fiction by a Pacific Islander writer in this country, which, when I say that, feels like a crime in of itself. So yeah, it's a coming of age novel about a young mixed race Tongan girl who's trying to put all the pieces of herself together in the suburbs of Mount Druitt.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And Mohammed?
Hi, everyone. Firstly, I just want to say, Winnie's new book will be out in March or maybe like April next year. But there is a book right now that she's just released. It's called Another Australia, that she's edited. It's a really fantastic book that features some of the best writers across Australia from First Nations and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And it does centre and celebrate Pacific identities. So please take an opportunity to check out that book, and then keep an eye out for Dirt Poor Islanders next year.
Shankari's in it, by the way.
Shankari's in Another Australia as well, yes. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to tell you all is a friend of mine named Catherine Knight, who was an academic, sadly passed away a short while ago. And she was a brilliant academic and scholar. She wrote this fantastic book called Passion, Purpose and Meaning, Arts Activism in Western Sydney. So very relevant to today's panel. And her daughter, after her mother passed away, her daughter contacted me and told me that her mum has all these books and she wants them to go to a really nice home. So she sent us a couple of boxes. And so any copy of my books, Shankari's books, or Winnie's books that you buy today, you'll get a free copy of this from the bookstore. So just when you go to the bookstore, grab our books and just tell them you want your copy of this. It should be on the counter and they'll give you a free copy. So that's the first two things I wanted to say. The second, so now to answer your question, can you remind me what it was?
Can you give me the setup of your most recent book?
Yeah. It's very hard for me to just recount narrative. I need to speak, if I'm going to answer questions like that, I need to speak about them ideologically. So I identify as being from an Arab and a Muslim background, grew up in Western Sydney. My family are from Lebanon and Syria originally. And some of you might remember the late Bill Leak. Do you remember the cartoonist? So just actually shortly before he passed away, he drew quite a controversial cartoon of an Indigenous father not recognizing his Indigenous son when he's being interrogated by an Indigenous cop. And it resulted in outrage right across Australia. What people don't know is that actually Bill Leak had been doing very similar cartoons about Arab and Muslim men for years before that. And when I say similar, I'm talking about images of Arab and Muslim men in militant garb and Muslim writing on their foreheads in Arabic, telling their children, go and win daddy's propaganda war for them, and throwing them into the war zones. Very similar to the images and the accusations that are being made against the Palestinians right now. And when it comes to black men and when it comes to brown men, the subtext to these kinds of stories are always the same, that we don't love our children as much as white men do. And so to answer your question, I wrote my book, The Other Half of You, which is my latest novel, as a love letter to my son, who is a mixed race, Arab and Anglo-Australian, who is being raised in a multi-faith and multicultural household. And I wanted to tell him the story of how he came to be.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Shankari.
I hate speaking after Mohammed. So Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens is set in a nursing home in Western Sydney, a fictional suburb, fictional nursing home. It is in this nursing home, the residents and the staff who work there, many of them are ancestrally from Sri Lanka, their lives and their histories intersect in this place of community. And it is set against the backdrop of rising racism in contemporary Australia, but also flashes back to their lives in Sri Lanka and what it is that has brought them to Australia. It is very much about the power of storytelling and the way that we use stories to create community, to hold on to our memories, to hold on to our culture, and to create a new home for ourselves.
Thank you. So all of you are writing about people living in Western Sydney. And I wanted to ask what Western Sydney meant to you, as opposed to, the nightly news, Western Sydney, problem this, problem that, floodplain, more and more disasters. I mean, my university opened a campus in Western Sydney, and one of the first courses that they offered there, for some bizarre reason, was ancient history. And it was like, what were they thinking? Why would people in Western Sydney want to study ancient history? So let me ask you, is that where you were born? Is that where you grew up? What does Western Sydney mean to you? Winnie, can I ask you first?
Yeah, so as a Pacific Islander, somebody who's Tongan, I was the first person in my family to go to university, but it wasn't until I joined Sweatshop Literacy Movement, which is a movement dedicated to empowering First Nations people and culturally and linguistically diverse people through reading, writing and critical thinking, that I learned about what literacy actually is. And the quote, I'm sure Mohammed will correct me if I get it wrong, but it's by African-American feminist and scholar Bell Hooks, who says, literacy is how we determine what we see, or how we see what we see. So growing up in Mount Druitt, the representation I actually saw of Mount Druitt was the very well-known documentary series by SBS called Struggle Street. And the opening of that show is a very picturesque Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is not too far from us. It zooms all the way through Sydney, and then it opens up to a welcome to Mount Druitt sign that has graffiti all over it, and then a fart noise plays. And so it really felt like I grew up in the arse end of Sydney. And because I only saw representations of young, impoverished women who were pregnant and doing drugs, and gangs and shootings and needles on the floor. That's what I actually thought growing up in Mount Druitt meant for me, even though I was literally living in the suburb that SBS was doing the documentary on, because that's all I saw. of my suburb reflected back at me. And so for me, growing up in Western Sydney, I felt very embarrassed. And as somebody who really liked reading and writing, but who had no books in my house, as somebody who liked school but had no one in my family who achieved even an ATAR, it was hard for me to imagine it was hard for me to imagine Western Sydney as beautiful. And so it wasn't actually until I went to a writing workshop at Western Sydney University that Mohammed ran that I actually saw Western Sydney literature for the first time. It was a poem written by high school kids they were just teasing each other about being gay, even though they were friends and they were not gay. But they were using this like really funny, ironic Western Sydney slang to talk to each other. And it really brought the voice and sound and feel of Western Sydney to the forefront of my mind. And it was only then that I realized Western Sydney could be beautiful. And from there, that's where I dedicated my writing to overcome those stereotypes that I grew up with.
When you were describing that, I was thinking of that notion of dysmorphia, like when you have body dysmorphia, when you're in one body but you don't see it. That's kind of like what you had. You had Western Sydney dysmorphia in terms of imagination.
I'm going to steal that phrase. Yeah, definitely.
Mohammed, what does it mean to you?
So two things. First, one of the most inspiring and energizing things about my work, Winnie talks about coming to a workshop that I ran about 6 years ago, and the amazing collaboration we've had since then. Today, before she came here, she was at a school in Western Sydney running workshops, teaching young, culturally and linguistically diverse people to read, write, and think critically. And so we're seeing this knowledge being passed on from generation to generation, and that's really the most important aspect of our work. The other thing I want to say is, Shankari, this is the first time we've sat on a panel together since you won the Miles Franklin. I'm touched by what you had to say, but I feel really honored to be sitting in your company as well. Thank you. So now to answer your question. So, it's interesting the way you framed it at the beginning, away from the way you framed the question is away from the stereotypes of Western Sydney, like what's the real experience of growing up in the western suburbs of Sydney? And this might surprise you, especially hearing it from somebody who's a Western Sydney patriot and who's a Western Sydney activist who really is proud of Western Sydney. The stereotypes are kind of true. So, there's an assumption that I'm just going to come out here and talk about all the positive aspects of Western Sydney to counteract the negative aspects. In cultural theory, that's called burden of representation, that we feel the pressure to say positive things to compensate for all the negative things that are said about our communities. But here's the thing that I find so fascinating about the region is actually my work with the young men of color, First Nations men, Arab men, Pacifica men, men from African backgrounds and Asian backgrounds, is that in many cases, they play up the stereotype. They don't play it down. And there's a name for this. In anthropology, it's called protest masculinity, which is the compensation for marginalization through the symbolic assertion of power and aggression. Basically, it's empowering to play a gangster because it scares racist white people. And so in the year 1998, where my research begins, there's a front page of the Daily Telegraph, and the heading is "Dial a Gun." The subtitle is "Gang Says It's Easier Than Buying a Pizza." And there's a picture of a group of boys from my school all flashing gang signs. And they made up this story about how they could get a gun easier than ordering a pizza, which was completely fictional. Actually, most of those boys went on to university. And you can even see from the photo, they're just smiling, like they're just taking the piss. Now, if you ask those men, those young men, why do you do that? Why do you play up the stereotype instead of play it down? You know what they'll tell you? Easiest way to pick up chicks, bro. And when you talk to the girls, they're like, I love Punch Bowl Boys. They were the bad boys. So you can understand how actually it's not about saying we're going to necessarily push up against the stereotype, but understanding the complexities of the stereotype. Where does the stereotype come from? And how do boys in our neighborhood manipulate it and and tap into it for the best possible outcome for them.
I love that. I love the idea that it's a way to get chicks. And as you know, as someone who was attracted to bad boys myself when I was younger, I'm married not to a bad boy now, but I do understand that. I completely get it. Shankari, Western Sydney, you.
Oh, so much then. So before I forget, I feel like I always need to write down things that Mohammed says. Burden of representation is something that I feel I have struggled with my whole literary career, let alone, in fact, my entire life, right? Always having to come forward as the good immigrant, always having to play and participate in the stereotype of academic, quiet, well-behaved, dutiful, hardworking. And that is all that becomes reflected in my literature. And I think one of the things that I've been really grateful to Mohammed for and Sweatshop is to challenge that burden of representation and to become increasingly comfortable with just representation. So just to represent myself with the same prerogative and same privilege that anybody else represents themselves, which is to say simply honestly. The second thing I wanted to say was, and I will answer your question because it comes from how you began the question. So before you began the question, you talked about universities in the West and ancient history. Why would they set up a curriculum there on ancient history? And I was thinking, why not? Because, and this is why, so to deconstruct the language. So I presume when you said ancient history, now I presume, you meant Greek and Roman history, yes. So when you said ancient history, and why would you want to set that up in Western Sydney? I was thinking, because we all have incredibly ancient histories. South Asian history is 5,000 plus years old. It has a rich tradition of literature, poetry, music, intellectualism, spirituality, science, mathematics. So of course we'd want to study our history. And so there's a really interesting, there are assumptions and there's power and there's in our dialogue. But back to your question about Western Sydney. So I grew up, my parents left Sri Lanka in the 70s, moved to London to escape civil war, were able to go to study, so a very traditional sort of colonial path. You leave the colonies, you go back to England, and then came out to Australia in search of work at the time when the White Australia policy had just ended. So it was a lot of fun for them. And then we grew up in Canberra and felt very culturally isolated because it was a tiny community of colour. There was one kid that I was allowed to sleep over at her house. And we couldn't fit in and we weren't allowed to really mix or integrate deeply with our white Australian friends. And there weren't enough of us brown people to come together with any sort of richness of community. And as soon as I was old enough, I left Canberra to come to Sydney because in Sydney, in Western Sydney, an incredible South Asian community, and in particular, an incredible Sri Lankan Tamil community. So suddenly, it was cool to be Sri Lankan Tamil. And I was not the odd girl out. I was just one of many medical students and accounting students and engineering students, but they were thriving and celebrating and loving their culture and proud of it. And so Western Sydney is where, throughout my childhood, we spent a lot of our time. Coming from Canberra, we would go to Western Sydney. And then when I did my university years, I lived in Western Sydney and just felt a real sense of identity and connection with my identity, refinding my identity, celebrating it, and then wanting to record it increasingly through storytelling.
Am I right in thinking you were all born in Australia?
Yeah, can I just tell
Yeah,
Shankari
do you want to
something?
respond? Yeah,
I just want to tell you something. When I first started my arts activism in Western Sydney when I was a teenager, I participated in a project called SAME. Do you want to know why it was called SAME? Because it stood for South Asian Middle Eastern.
That's rather wonderful. But the reason why I was making that comment about assuming that you were all born in Australia, I wasn't. And I'm not Australian. I haven't taken out Australian citizenship. And one of the reasons I haven't is, forgive me this term, but I've always described myself as a Thatcher refugee. I left England when Margaret Thatcher was in power, having come from the north of England when they closed the shipyards and the coal mines and they started to attack public education and the National Health Service. I came to Australia on the day they introduced Medicare, thinking that I'd come to a socialist enclave. However, my first experience of arriving was my sister was a 10-pound pom and had married a cane farmer in Bundaberg. So my first experience of Australia was Bundaberg, while Joe Bjelke-Petersen was in fact the premier. And I'd been living in Paris and I arrived in Bundaberg and I thought I'd landed on the far side of the moon because I could not believe the attitudes, the racism, the intolerance of Indigenous people. And that was when I realized, after I came to Melbourne and I met the academic community, the diverse community, people who like me had come from all over the world to study and to learn together, I realized that there was a very, very different experience of Australia, that there was not one Australia, there were many, many Australias, if you like. So I actually wanted that to be a segue into how your books reflect on what it means to be Australian for you. And we can start anywhere you like. And please feel free to talk to each other as well. I don't, as the white person on a diverse panel, I do not intend to bogart the conversation, and I would love it to be as fluid as possible. So please feel free.
I'll start off by saying it's just funny that you said many, many Australians, because obviously the anthology series that I edited with Affirm Press is called Another Australia, and it's predicated on the idea that there are many layers of this complicated continent, and there are many stories, and so there's never just one version of Australia. There's many multiple realities of this complicated continent, and I think considering the outcome of The Voice that just happened like 2 weeks ago, that's more prominent now than ever. And so if you're ever wanting to ask the question, were you born in Australia, I feel like Another Australia is a really good place to start.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Oh, sure. So what's the question again? I was not born in Australia, by the way. I was born in London. But what's the question?
The question was, the question
identity.
was about how your books reflect and explore what it means to be Australian for you.
Yeah, so my novel, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, is absolutely about, the entire novel from page 1 to the very end is entirely about what it has meant to be Australian for me and what it means, what I believe, who I believe gets to decide that. So I think that there is a national identity within Australia that for the better part of my lifetime here, I came when I was 3, I'm now 49, for the better part of my lifetime, a particular version of Australia and a particular identity, if not fantasy, has been, to use Gus's words, has been asserted, and at times asserted against those of us that don't fit that identity. And in fact weaponized against us to decide who it is that is Australian and who it is who is here on a sort of conditional, permission-only basis. And then that affects how we, or I, participate in Australian society as an Australian. I remember hearing someone say once, they always feel like they're on probation. And so my novel deliberately looks into that issue, or deliberately tries to interrogate that issue, because for most of my life, I've thought about it, I've observed it, I've felt it, I've experienced it, but actually never felt comfortable to talk about it, unless I'm talking about it with my cousins, with my friends of color. Increasingly, when I joined Sweatshop, felt a very safe space to discuss it there, but never outside of that circle, because you didn't want to upset people. You didn't want to stick your head above the parapet, and you didn't also want to seem ungrateful for the fact that Australia had allowed us in, given us refuge from a civil war, an opportunity to create a safe life for ourselves and for our children. And at the same time, there are conditions to that in itself, and the concept of migrant. And as I've gotten older, and in particular, as I've understood more about First Nations communities and their identities, and the multiplicity of their identities, increasingly feel we've tricked ourselves, really, haven't we? The word migrant, in the way that migrant is used, everybody who came after 1788 is a migrant. And if we could accept that, we would see this country very differently. We would see ourselves in a concept of community, and communities very differently. And so in Chinatown at Cinnamon Gardens, I've really tried to interrogate that through storytelling, and to come to terms with my place in Australia.
I think you're so right. I think we are all, I think of myself as a migrant. I still think of that. You know, that's my identity. I'm still a traveller, a citizen of the world, as it were. And I don't, yeah.
Well, interestingly, sorry, Mohammed, also First Nations people will think of themselves as diasporic if they're not on their country, which in itself fascinates me. So deep is their connection to their country that if they are, you know, this idea of nationhood is actually a political modern day construct, often a construct of colonialism.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, keep going.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think that's why you said it much better than I did in terms of my suspicion of that. And within my own school, which is a School of the Arts, English and Media, we've been having weekly sessions with an Indigenous elder who is leading us into very early areas of Indigenous knowledge about being on country. And in fact, I'm missing a day which would have been spent on Mount Kira with him today. And I'm learning extraordinary things about the relationship between people and place, which I feel, you know, I can understand how it works. Mohammed.
Yeah. So you don't need to apologize. I'm listening. I'm really engaged in the dialogue. So I want to go back to your original point about were you born in Australia, because I think, and even if I'm wrong, this is what I'm interpreting from the question, is you're not born in Australia, but and we are, or you're not born in Australia, but you're born in another place where the dominant culture is white. Yeah. The question is, when it's like, are you born in Australia? The subtext to the question is, are you born in the country that your parents are from? And so for all of us, the answer is no. But you ask me, am I born in Australia? The answer is yes. In contradistinction to yourself, you're not born in Australia. But I think what I'm drawing from that is, if you're white and you're not born in Australia, you're still made to feel more Australian than if you're a person of color and you're born in Australia. So I'd like to unpack that. I'd like to help dissect that idea. So Shankari brought up Ghassan Haj. So Ghassan Haj is an important anthropologist based in the University of Melbourne, internationally renowned, and he's got an incredible book called White Nation. It's actually 25 years old. Just by chance, it's been republished. Sweatshop republished it. It's called The Racial Politics of Australian Multiculturalism. You can find it on our website if you're interested, sweatshop.ws. But Ghassan defines whiteness as a fantasy position of cultural dominance born out of the history of European expansion. That there's a kind of mastery of the nation that white people imagine themselves having, a kind of manager or a facilitator role that is completely a fantasy because it doesn't coincide with the reality of a multicultural society. I'll give you a really good example that just happened in the last 24 hours. John Howard having his tantrum and saying, I've always had my troubles with multiculturalism. That is what Ghassan Haj will call the white nation fantasy. It's a fantasy not so much about having a problem with multiculturalism, but thinking that somehow you are a facilitator or a manager of multiculturalism. When I hear John Howard say things like that, I'm like, whether you have troubles with it or not, whether you have problems with it or not, I don't give a shit. It doesn't make a difference to me. It doesn't make a difference to Winnie. It doesn't make a difference to Shankari. We're here, we're raising our kids here, and it's not going to change. It's a fantasy to think that you play a role in deciding whether we are going to be a multicultural society or not. It's a multicultural society whether you like it or not. And we are Australian whether we are accepted by the dominant white culture as Australian or not. And so part of the work that we're doing through our writing as writers of color, as culturally and linguistically diverse writers, is to redefine what the reality of Australia is in contrast to the fantasy of Australia.
That's beautifully put. Yeah, yeah. There's an agreement there. I think this would be a good moment actually to talk about the work of Sweatshop. And by the way, I know Gaston Harsh. I've been reading his work for a long time. The work of Sweatshop. Winnie, you were running a workshop today in a private...
Sorry, I just feel really, really compelled to tell everyone, because Gaston's come up now and his work's been mentioned. Just sorry. I should actually let you know, for the last 2 weeks and for the next 2 days, if you go on the Sweatshop website, sweatshop.ws, every copy of The Racial Politics of Australian Multiculturalism, which is only $29.95, every dollar of that goes to Palestinian charities to help children in Gaza. So right now is actually a very good time to invest in that book. You'll learn about the history of Australian racial politics, and you'll also be making a donation to support children in Gaza. We've already raised $9,000. We've got 2 days to go, and we're trying to get to 10,000.
Okay, good plug. Winnie, the workshop today, what were you doing with the primary school children?
As the general manager, I'll talk about what I do at Sweatshop if I can, and I'll let Mohammed speak to the rest of it because he's the founding director. He found Sweatshop, so there's nobody else better to talk about Sweatshop than him. But as the general manager, I do a lot of project management. I edit our yearly anthologies that come out, and I also run writing workshops in Western Sydney high schools. And so the one I had today in particular was quite new for me because we usually don't work with such young children. They're in year 4, and so I'm sure many of you might be parents or had children who were in year 4 once upon a time. They're very hard to make focus. And yeah, and to actually want to put pen to paper. But myself and Adam Navaldi Anderson, who's the editor of our upcoming anthology called Povo, which is about class in Western Sydney, we worked with the kids for a month to work on their writing skills. So we don't just go into the workshops and say, oh, kids, write about what you did today and, be on your merry way. We want to teach them the craft of writing, and we want to teach them that writing is actually a skill you can learn, but it's quite a hard skill. And it's something that if you're wanting to be a writer, you kind of have to, if you want to be a good writer, be university educated, really, and have acquired a lot of knowledge to be able to be a great writer. Just like any skill set, like being a doctor or a mechanic, that's where I put being a writer. You wouldn't let a mechanic come into your house that hasn't done at least a TAFE degree, because otherwise forget it. So with the kids, we actually teach them the structure of a story. Does anybody know what a structure of a story is?
Beginning, middle, end?
Yes! So it usually takes a while for people to get that. So good on you, Susan.
Do I get a certificate?
Yeah, no wonder why you're on the board. So yeah, it's a beginning, a middle, and end. We get them to structure their stories in that way. We get them to think about their voice, how they sound like. We teach them descriptions, how to describe things, comparison like as. These all sound really simple, but when you're building upon them and you're really thinking about it, it can actually be quite hard. And one of the last things the students said to me at the very last workshop was, writing is hard. And by the time that we left, they all had a kind of full stories about how tabbouleh smells like my mum's fingers, or how what was the other one? How like my cat smells like a cookie, like just weird things like that I found really beautiful, and that we kind of had to drag out of the kids over that 4-week period. And when I asked them what they learnt out of that, they said good writing comes from what you know, and it comes from being very specific. And so being able to teach the kids that, and knowing that they walked away with that kind of critical thinking skills, to me is the most valuable part of my job, because it means that the next generation of Western Sydney writers are up and coming.
Which is why ChatGPT will never take over, because my cat smells like what was it?
A cookie.
A cookie is ChatGPT won't do that. It just, unless you got it. Well, never mind. I was trying to get ChatGPT to write crime novels by different people, and they were terrible, absolutely appalling. But the freshness and originality of that vision is the human perception. Mohammed, you founded Sweatshop. Where did that come from? What was your impulse? How did that, and why Sweatshop? Because writing's hard work.
It is hard work. I mean, we already started to touch on this. So let me explain it this way. I'm a Lebo from Punchbowl. So like all the Lebos in Punchbowl, we're very hairy, but we get it under control. And the way we get it under control is all the boys do laser hair removal. So I've got no underarm hair. I've got no hair on my arms or my back or my shoulders. And I always, once a month I go to these laser hair clinics, and it's quite an uncomfortable experience. You're usually with a young woman who is, her profession is laser hair removal and beauty. So they're always quite beautiful. They're always dolled up. And I'm sitting there topless getting zapped. So in that awkwardness, I always make a little bit of chit chat to make the time go by. And I'll ask them about what they're doing. Are you going to do this for the rest of your life? Are you studying? Are you, planning to travel? And eventually, after I found out about them, they'll say, "What do you do?" And I don't usually like to tell people I'm a writer, because it feels a little bit pretentious. But every now and again, when I'm in a good mood, I'll say, as a matter of fact, I'm a writer. I'm an author. And every time I've done that in the laser hair clinic centers, these young women stop. They stop zapping me. And they go, "You know who should be a writer? Me." People tell me I've got the most interesting life. That's what they always say to me. And you know what I find interesting about that idea is it's actually probably true. Like if your life was zapping hair from bumholes all day, you probably have an interesting life. You have some, I mean, the stories they've told me about picking toilet paper out of people's, bums before they zap the hair out, is quite, for me as a writer and as a storyteller, it's quite fascinating. But the problem with that immediate reaction of, who should be a writer? Me, I've got the most interesting life, is that it's predicated on the assumption that all you need to be a good writer is an interesting life. And it discounts the craft and the skill that's hardwired into good storytelling. And so for us, when we're developing literature in Western Sydney, there's two components. One component is actually already covered, and that's the interesting part. If you live in Western Sydney, you would know that 100 different languages are being spoken on one street at the same time, at any moment in time. It's a cultural melting pot, and these are stories that are predominantly uncharted. They have not been told to Australian audiences yet. 95% of Australian publishing is white. So there are stories in Western Sydney that have been untapped that are worthy of discovering. We've got that part covered. The part we don't have covered yet is the skills development, learning the craft, learning about form, about perspective, about tense, about managing metaphors, about metaphorical networks, about tone, about rhythm, about the differences between a poem, a short story, a novel, a novella, a vignette. Every single element of writing and how we learn through research to develop that. And the idea is, if you combine those two things, experience with craft, you'll develop Miles Franklin winners. I'm sitting next to one.
Shankari, what was your involvement in Sweatshop? You mentioned it earlier, and you're part of this anthology. Oh, I'm sorry. How did you become involved with Sweatshop?
So I have always felt like a Sweatshop imposter, because I don't feel that I deserve the mantle of it, but I'm also very grateful to be a part of the collective. I joined later in life, as I came to writing later in life, and have certain limitations in life because we have many children. And so it's been wonderful for me, for example, that Sweatshop has an online platform, an online workshop that enables me and many others, I imagine, to join. And I came to it initially obliquely because I was overwhelmed by the talent and overwhelmed by the discipline and hard work that I knew them to have and to be executing on. And also very shy about my own writing and uncomfortable in my own voice and unwilling to push it out there and sort of stick my head above the parapet and getting better at doing that now. And so I came to it obliquely, but having stalked them and watched them for a long time and watched what they were achieving and how they were working with authors, with writers. And the first thing you get sent if you want to sign up to Sweatshop is an essay by Mohammed on bad writing. It is terrifying. And Mohammed will tell you about the essay himself later, but it is terrifying to read it, and it's got a real buyer beware thing about it, right? you don't enter into Sweatshop lightly. It's almost like a social contract. If you want to be a part of it, then you have to step up and subject yourself to the critique, be curious and open to that, to write and be critiqued with humility, and be prepared to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And so I eventually summoned up the courage to be a part of Sweatshop and subject my work to it. And Winnie has very graciously edited 2 pieces for me, which have been in 2 of your anthologies. And for me, I think, having grown up just only ever seeing white people write about life in Australia, it was sort of everything from the new frontier, not even Aboriginal writing, not even First Nations writing, the new frontier to, gritty Melbourne, whatever it was. But it certainly was not my life, was not my community or my lived experience. So to see these writers emerge primarily from Western Sydney and to have their stories refined and to have them to learn the craft of writing. And I think in many ways we end up having to write better than other storytellers. I really do. It's a bit like that thing of Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards in heels. And that's how it feels sometimes being a writer of colour in Australia. And they empowered us and continue to empower us to do that.
I will just say, sorry, that I had the pleasure of working with Shankari on the Sweatshop anthologies called Sweatshop Women. It's the first anthology series in Australia that's completely edited, written, and designed by women of colour. And I still think of, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Column to this day. It's a really fantastic, short, beautiful piece of writing. And so if you're wanting to see what the Miles Franklin winner was producing before she was the Miles Franklin, Sweatshop Women at sweatshop.ws is the way to go.
Okay, but let me ask you the question, given where we are, is it always that you think that you are writing within the, very kind of created false notion of literary fiction as opposed to genre fiction? And would you ever think of writing a crime novel?
So my publisher, when I discuss this, who also Robert Mohammed and I have shared a publisher in the past, Robert Watkins. He says to me, just write whatever you want to write. And so I think for me, because I had previously thought, my literary journey has been one of wandering and compromising and making myself almost try to write to a formula in order to get published. So I wrote a novel, it wasn't published because it was in Australia because it wasn't Australian enough. I then wrote a novel and changed my protagonist from being brown to being white in order to get it published. That got published. And then I eventually just wrote Chai Time at Cinema Gardens thinking it'll never be published, so I'm just going to write whatever the hell I want to write. And turns out it got published and it is considered an Australian novel. So now I feel actually, in part from many things, the encouragement and support of many people, including Sweatshop, that I'm just going to write whatever I want to write. And that will include crime from time to time because I love crime. I also like being able to subvert crime and use storytelling to, for example, in Western Sydney, to show a different kind of Western Sydney than that which is expected of us or unfairly represented in other spaces.
I'll just quickly say something. I think every form of writing is autobiographical fiction. So whether it's, Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, my favorite example to use is that she wrote the Dementors in Harry Potter as a way to express the grief, as a metaphor, to express the grief that she felt after her mother passed away. And the Dementors were a direct result of that lived experience of hers. I also think in the case, so if we think of everything as autobiographical fiction, it's really hard for me to think about genre fiction and writing in a particular genre. And I particularly say this because I had the privilege and I think sadness to work with a multi-award winning author named Amani Haider, who wrote The Mother Wound. And in that book, it's a memoir, and she writes about the fact that her father killed her mother, and also the fact that her grandmother was displaced by Israeli soldiers and experienced that cycle of war that the IDF do on a regular basis. And for me, knowing Amani and knowing her story, the idea of writing crime as something that's, for lack of a better term, fun or a creative exercise feels really disrespectful to people who actually have that lived experience and have to live with that kind of crime and trauma for the rest of their lives. And so the answer is no, because I would rather much hear from someone like Amani.
I've read The Mother Wound, and it is very, very powerful piece of writing. And I understand that. I understand that impulse, which is that it would seem disrespectful. You don't want to write crime as entertainment. Yeah.
So in my case, the Arab Australian community is one of the most heavily affiliated with crime in Australia. In fact, there was a crime squad in Australia in 2007 that was set up called the Middle Eastern Crime Squad, which when African Americans who come from 400 years of slavery come to Australia and hear about this, they say, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard, that there's a squad in Australia, police force, that's specifically designed to target Middle Eastern communities. And when the police commissioner in 2007 was asked, how can you justify such a crime squad? He said, we've got crime squads for all kinds of things. Like we've got crime squads for pedophiles. Yes, but a pedophile is a criminal. It's not criminal to be Middle Eastern. So the experience of being a Middle Eastern Australian is inherently criminalized. So all of my work is always about crime. Probably my most well-known book is The Lebs. This is the book I wrote before The Other Half of You. And it's broken up into 3 categories: drug dealers and drive-bys, gang rape, and war on terror. They're the 3 parts of the book. And they look at those 3 criminalized elements of the community. But what I try to do with each component is unpack, deconstruct, reverse engineer the information that you've been fed. That's the first part of the answer. So that's my personal answer. I also want to give an intellectual answer because you asked a question that was about the distinction between literary fiction and genre fiction. So it's argued by, there's a bit of bias here, but it's argued by linguists, which is my field, that what makes human beings a unique species compared to every other species on Earth is language. That is what makes us distinct. And every single achievement that human beings have accessed at some point is a byproduct of the fact that we have language. Now, Darwinists, or to be more precise, social Darwinists, believe that the primary function of language is communication. But the linguists argue that even if you look at the most sophisticated animal on Earth, aside from a human, the maximum amount of words that they can learn is about 60. So we're talking about chimpanzees. And they are actually able to communicate perfectly fine with each other with only about 60 different language cues. Whereas every individual human being knows between tens of thousands of words to hundreds of thousands of words. That's the average human being. We're quite incredible that way. There's something very special about us. So it raises the question, well, what is the purpose of language? And the world's most recognized and respected linguist, Noam Chomsky, argues that the activity of language for human beings is not communication, it's thought. And the majority of the time, what you're doing with language is thinking, processing information, deconstructing it. And so for me, what is my role as a writer? It's to engage at the highest level in the greatest things that human beings are capable of doing, which is thinking through language in its broadest capacity. And if a genre fiction, a story, a narrative comes out of that as a byproduct, great. But my role and my job as a literary person, first and foremost, is to celebrate that unique human ability to create beautiful, complex language.
Oh, that's a great ambition and a great achievement. We've got time for perhaps one or two questions, and I would say, please, a question, not a statement, if we have any from the audience. Yeah, we do. There's one there. We'll just wait for the mic.
Yes, one of the things that's come out of Western Sydney is a lot of work around poetry. At a time when in other parts of Sydney, young people aren't necessarily that interested in poetry. I just wondered what your thoughts were and why it's such a strong, has so strong presence.
Can I just clarify before we talk about it? Are you talking about poetry as it's been published, or are you talking specifically about poetry slamming?
Poetry slamming.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have some strong opinions on this, but does someone want to start?
So poetry both on the poetry slamming is a accessible form of expression, is what I would say. And that's because in Western Sydney, there's over 100 different cultures. We're the largest, most densely populated and most diverse region in Australia. And a lot of those backgrounds myself included, and everybody else on this panel, come from a tradition of oral storytelling. So Tongans, Pacific Islanders, never wrote anything down. We told stories through what we call apunake. And that's a cultural and community figure who tells stories through song, through dance, and through painting. So on a natu, which is a type of Tongan mat. And so because we have that oral storytelling tradition and background, poetry slamming is very accessible in that way. It's also produced, I think, really amazing writers that I've had the pleasure of working with in another Australia, like the rapper El Fresh the Lion, who's from a Sikh background, grew up in Campbelltown, and Omar Musa, who's from a Bornean background, Muslim, and who grew up in Canberra. Because we have those traditional oral storytelling backgrounds, poetry slamming can be a really great way to find really amazing talent like El Fresh the Lion, and to kind of express yourself to your community. Is it a form of literature? I say no. Because it's one thing to get up and I think express yourself in a kind of cultural way, but what I will say is a lot of it in a very cliche way. And then because it's so accessible, it kind of opens the field up to anyone. And opening the field up to anyone means you're going to get a bad egg or two. That's in any field. And so it has its place and its purpose, poetry slamming, and it does engage young people. But the little tunnel, I think, that filters through from slam poetry to then published writer is few and far between, but it does happen. And I feel like that transition is very important, because then those kinds of writers have a unique set of skills in oral storytelling that they then transition into publication. So the writer who just published her first novel, Sarah M. Saleh, calls herself a slambassador, but she wrote this incredibly poetic, lyrical, sensual, not in the sexual way, but in the physical way, novel called Songs for the Dead and the Living. Even in the title, you know how poetic her voice is. And so for me, don't be too nervous about young people being obsessed with slam poetry. I think slam poetry is there for a reason, and then eventually you'll get somebody like Sarah Saleh.
It's a wonderful answer. Look, we are out of time, and I just want to, I want you to join with me in thanking our panel for the most insightful and illuminating and glorious conversation.
Thank you, and
all.
thank you, Susan, for
Thank you.
this dialogue. Please remember, you'll get a free copy of this if you grab any one of our books. So just head to the bookstore and you can get yourself a copy.
Yes,
Thank
there'll
you.
be. Please continue the conversation with our authors outside.
Yeah,
while
we'll be signing
buying
books as well.
Yes, absolutely. They'll be signing books. Please leave the auditorium, and if you are able to come tomorrow or Sunday, please buy some more tickets, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much for coming.
It's always so nice to talk to you.